So good morning, and thank you very much to Marilyn and the entire team at Celiac Disease Foundation for inviting me to be with you today. It's really humbling for those of us who work in research and development to have the contact with patients is what keeps us going and gives us motivation to keep working harder. I'm trying to convince you today that without NIH funding, there will be no medications, no diagnostics, no solutions for patients. And you need to go out and talk to your members of Congress, talk to all of the stakeholders so that we can together increase that funding. These are my disclosures. In the pharmaceutical industry, you always have to disclose who you're affiliated with so that you disclose your biases. My biases, I've been working in celiac disease for more than 20 years. I am a clinical immunologist from Spain. I came to the US, immigrated to become a scientist here at the NIH. Eventually left to develop medicines. I did my PhD in celiac. You may not know that celiac was the first autoimmune disorder for which the trigger was found, gluten. And that because of that, a lot of other diseases have advanced. Thanks to celiac, we now understand the triggers of T1D, diabetes, multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis. The mechanisms of the disease are the same in all of those diseases, but everything started with celiac. However, paradoxically, even though the science advanced in celiac first, the treatments and the solutions were stalled by the false sense of solution of the gluten-free diet. And the misleading lack of awareness that actually the diet doesn't work in up to half of patients at all times. So once that was clear, I left the NIH. I went to a company called Alba Therapeutics, just the second startup company for celiac in the US. Eventually, that drug was advanced by another company called Innovate. I left. I went to Johnson & Johnson. I was the head of early development, and I was informed that I could never be promoted at Johnson & Johnson if I continued to work in celiac, because celiac was not of interest for the pharmaceutical industry. This is changing. We now have Takeda, Dan Levler, and his colleagues, and now we have Amgen. So two big pharmaceutical companies that are finally interested in celiac. So that has changed a lot. I left Johnson & Johnson to work in celiac. So I started a company called Celimmune. Eventually, our drug worked in phase 2. Amgen acquired Celimmune. Then I started a company called Provention Bio. We have a drug for celiac and also a vaccine for celiac. I'll tell you a little bit about that. But not everybody needs drugs. If you can avoid gluten, you don't need the drug. The problem is half of all celiac patients on a gluten-free diet continue to eat gluten. It's hidden, it's everywhere. If you have a positive antibody test, the most likely 90% of the cases is because you're eating gluten. It's hidden in your food and you don't know where it is. So we started a company called Glutenostics and Biometal to develop tests that could help patients find gluten that's hidden in their diets. And I'll tell you about that as well. I want to stress how patients influence scientists, companies. You cannot underestimate the power of your speaking up. Obviously, we need to develop therapeutics for celiac disease because it's a very serious condition. It's very common. A normal diet has 20,000 milligrams of gluten per day, 20,000 milligrams per day. If you eat 50 milligrams per day, you get gut mucosal atrophy, the villi are gone, etc. So you have to go from 20,000 to less than 50. And that's the challenge of the gluten-free diet. And that's why we're developing medicines that could allow patients to at least do a successful gluten-free diet. If you're doing the diet, what's really tragic is that the diet is so difficult and people follow it and still remain active. That's a tragedy. We began doing research in the late 2008, 2009. Back in 2010, there were 4 companies working in celiac disease. And my slides are available to you, so you don't have to take notes because they're going to get a little busy, but it's just for reference. I show this slide because we understand the pathophysiology of celiac, the mechanism of the disease. We understand it very well, how gluten gets into the gut, it gets modified by transglutaminase, it gets presented to the lymphocytes, cytokines, which are inflammatory mediators, are produced, and there is an inflammation in the gut that leads to disease. We understand that very well, but still drug development is so difficult. All of these 4 companies spent more than $200 million and all failed. All of these companies don't exist anymore, or at least are not working in celiac anymore. We need a lot of investment. And the Celiac Disease Foundation and other patient support groups can actually play a role there as well. When we started Provention, our first investment was from the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation, JDRF, and because of that, we began to work in type 1 diabetes in addition to celiac. So you can influence what companies do. And the initial investment was modest, just maybe 1% of the funding. But it was the first investment, and that made others invest. So without the JDRF, Provention wouldn't exist. A lot of research has gone into celiac. Today, we have a lot of new products in development, more than 20. This is good news. All those products in green are in clinical trials. The products in blue are in animal experimentation still. But this is a false sense of advance in some way, because of all of these products, only 2 are in late stage development, meaning they could be on the market in 5 to 10 years. Everything else is going to take more than that. I just want to bring to your attention the contrast between how many clinical trials are being conducted in celiac disease today. It's about 10. There are more than 800 trials ongoing for Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis today. It's not even close. And the problem is, we know that most drugs in development will fail. In order to have one FDA-approved drug, you need to have at least 5 drugs in trials if you're lucky. So we are going to need a lot more research. A couple words about Provention Bio. We got very lucky. Our drug, PRV-015, AMG 714, it has 2 names because we are partnered with Amgen, and this molecule was initially developed by Amgen. It became the first experimental medication that was able to reduce both gluten-induced symptoms and gluten-induced inflammation. And that's why Amgen acquired Celiac. On the left of the slide, this is just diarrhea. People who received the gluten challenge had an increase, the line goes up, increase in diarrhea. People who were on drug did not experience diarrhea in response to a gluten challenge. On the right of the slide, this is the number of inflammatory cells in the gut. And at the dose level, at the high dose level of the drug, we see a reduction. So this was very encouraging. We are now going to start a phase 2b trial, which is the last stage before you can do phase 3, which is the confirmatory study. And the CDF was kind enough to put a flyer for this trial in your packets. You will hear us making noise and asking people to volunteer for the trial. we are looking for 220 celiac subjects who are on a gluten-free diet but continue to have symptoms, recurrent symptoms. Does everybody need a drug? Absolutely not. If you can avoid gluten, you don't need a drug. So we developed this test, glutenostics. The test is called Gluten Detect. And we have Tony Garamond here in the room, who is the CEO of Glutenostics. This is a test that allows you to test for gluten in your diet by measuring gluten in stool or urine at home in the privacy of your bathroom in 10 minutes. It's like a pregnancy test. So this is the surprise. This trial has two types of patients. In the first couple weeks of this trial, on the left of the figure, people were not supposed to eat any gluten. Then we gave them the gluten challenge, and you see the lines go up dramatically. That's the gluten challenge. And then at the end of the study, they stop eating gluten challenge, it goes back down. So the gluten challenge group worked very well. But we had a second group in the trial that was supposed not to be eating any gluten. They were negative symptoms, negative antibodies, but had mucosal atrophy. The endoscopy was damaged. In these subjects, that's the gray line that you see popping up in the bottom of the slide. These subjects were eating gluten and they had no idea about it. But that gluten was enough to keep their gut not healed. That's why we need to do a better job of avoiding gluten. The last product I'll tell you about is a vaccine against what we now know is the most common viral infection that leads to type 1 diabetes and celiac disease. All of this work has been done over 20 years thanks to Ed and his collaborators at the TEDdy study. Imagine the TEDdy study screened 400,000 children. That's why I said it's billions of dollars, because they were followed for 20 years, almost 15 plus. If you just charge a couple $1,000s per subject to follow for 15 years, which is probably not enough, that's $1 billion. It's a very expensive work, but thanks to that work, it was published just in November and December last year. They did a full virome analysis. They analyzed all the viruses that infect humans, and they found that Coxsackie B virus, which is a virus that causes hand, foot, mouth disease, and it's an enterovirus. It gives you diarrhea, respiratory symptoms. It was associated with T1D and celiac. 60% of all T1D patients and 20% of all celiac patients had an infection by Coxsackie B preceding the onset of the autoimmune disease. A lot of additional work demonstrated the mechanism why the virus goes into the insulin-producing cells and into the gut cells. And then when the immune system tries to kill the virus, it kills our cells. It leads to disease. So we're developing the first vaccine, and we will start the first human trial this year in 2020. So how does this all relate to what you're doing today? Without the NIH, none of these products would be on the research today. The NIH co-funded TEDdy, and thanks to TEDdy, we understand the triggers of T1D and celiac. The NIH discovered interleukin-15, which is the target for our drug that is in phase 2B. It's an inflammatory mediator. The NIH is giving money to companies like Immunogenics, and Jack will tell you about it, to do clinical trials. In the past few years, all drugs approved by the FDA have had some kind of NIH funding. Without NIH, there's no research. Without research, there are no solutions. And I will finish with showing how the funding for celiac at the NIH has been lagging. Is the line on the left, the blue line of the bar on the left, is always been lower than Crohn's, eosinophilic esophagitis, other gastrointestinal disorders. In 2018, Celiac disease received less than $5 million, while Crohn's disease received almost 70. So that is the trend we need to reverse. We need more money into research so that we can continue to advance solutions for this community. Thank you very much.